What I wanted to tell you now, and which is, so to say, the basis of regulation. The basis of regulation is, of course, a difficult situation that needs to be regulated, or where people have the feeling this should be regulated, right? So I want to tell you a bit about what is happening with media and journalism on the ground in the European Union, and what are the most pressing issues. So, and I have identified in total 9 points. I think you could add more, but I think these are more or less the basic points. Okay, the first one is, oops, where's my, maybe over there, huh? Yeah, wonderful. You cannot see the headline. That's very practical. Oh, move it down right here. Okay, first, what was a big, I thought about, okay, where to start. And I think the first chapter that is really important to understand also what is happening with media and regulation in the EU is the autocratic turn. The autocratic turn has also a back history. As you know, we had the enlargement of the EU in the year 2004 to 2007. So new nations were coming to the EU. And of course, to join the club, they all had a very, very liberal democratic agenda. So they were like role models for democracy. I'm now exaggerating a bit, but only a bit. But only a few years later, what we could observe was an autocratic turn in a lot of the countries that joined during the enlargement period. So here I try to name them, or at least part of them. So 2010, and I think this was really a turning point, Fidesz took over power in Hungary. Viktor Orban is now the role model for everybody who wanted to destroy really independent journalism and establish a more autocratic system. In 2012, Slovakia, we just discussed about that. Fico became, for the first time, prime minister. Was it the first time or was it the second time, I think, already in Slovakia? He was prime minister before. However, he's prime minister also today, and he tries to dismantle public service media and to establish something like state TV. 2012, SDS was mandated in Slovenia. Again, Prime Minister was Janez Janša. Janez Janša also tried to really stop his critics and tried, for example, to demolish the National News Agency. 2013, Labour came into power with Joseph Muscat. I will get back to that. 2015, peace carried the vote in Poland. The strongman in the background is Jarosław Kaczynski. Peace had a heavy influence on the media sector in Poland. In 2017, ANO won the elections in the Czech Republic. The prime minister was Andrej Babiš. Andrej Babiš himself is something like an oligarch, but he owns also a large share in the media business in the Czech Republic, right? So this is really, from our point of view, this is really a dangerous combination because, well, he of course features in his media himself and his politics. So, and of course, all these governments came into conflict in general with the European values and rights. And part of this conflict was then the design of the media sector. What is typical, of course, for autocratic regimes or regimes that try to be autocratic is media capture. We already talked about media capture. Marius Dragomir was presenting the playbook, how they take over the regulators, the national regulators, how they try to make public service media into propaganda machines, how they channel advertisement money to friendly publications, and so on and so forth. So this is very well known how it works, and it works in different states of the European Union. So I don't want to reiterate that too much. I just want to show you one example. That's a slide from a PowerPoint presentation of a journalist in Hungary, and showing their news on 12 different media outlets in the internet. And what you see is, well, they are all the same. Simply, the picture is the same. Headlines are more or less the same. Practically, it's completely unified. I mean, you have 12 different media outlets officially, but what they do is presenting the same stuff, even in the same layout with the same pictures and the same headlines, right? So that's then the end, of course, of media freedom and media pluralism. And that's the situation in Hungary, where Viktor Orban controls 80% of the market. 80% of the market. Use of slaps. We already talked a bit about slaps, didn't we? And you know what slaps are? Anybody who can explain what slaps are? So the term slap comes from the US, and you know, slap is usually a slap in the face, right? So that's the original meaning of it. But here it's an abbreviation of strategic lawsuits against public participation. So these slaps are now a common phenomena. They are not only playing a role in autocratic states, but also in all other states, including Germany, right? And slaps are not to design, they are not designed to win the court case, right? They are not designed to win the litigation. They are designed simply to exploit your resources. So they are meant to make you tired. They are meant to exploit your financial capabilities, right? So after years and years, probably in front of the court, you probably give in, right? Even though you know the other side is not able to win the court case, but probably you give in because you simply have the feeling, okay, I give my life away for this damn bloody court case, and I have to stop it now to really to focus on something else, right? Because you cannot go on forever. And that is exactly the effect that people who are running these kind of slabs are speculating on, right? So, and you can see the amount of slabs that is sometimes addressed to single persons. Usually it's not the organization that is dragged before court, it's the single person. So it won't be the University of Wittenherdecke, which is dragged before court, but probably you or you or you or you as a single person, right? Just also to diminish, you know, the protection that you have, and to make clear, okay, it's addressed to you as a single person, and we will get you. The Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, that was murdered in 2017, had all in all more than 45 cases against her, yeah, when she was murdered. It was, I think, 43 based on the civil law and 5 based on the criminal law. Usually, it's all about insults, for instance, or false claims, or whatever is then put in the foreground to discredit a journalist, right? And that is a huge problem, and the EU reacted and implemented, that's fairly new, the EU directive against SLAPs in the European Union. To give you also an example, what is happening in Germany, as you know, I worked for a long time in Leipzig, and in Leipzig you have a students' newspaper, right, which is partly, in fact, printed and handed out as a newspaper, but most of the traffic comes, of course, online, and people get informed through the website. And this newspaper is, of course, a non-profit. There are only students working there, right? And that's it. Probably it's something like it's something like sort of a service for other students, of course. And of course, it's for people who want to test their own journalistic abilities and so on and so forth. So Lutz published an article about a real estate developer in Leipzig. This real estate developer bought apartments and took each room of the apartment and rented it again to students for a tremendous price, right? So that was their business model. So fantastic business model. The owners of the real estate developers were young guys, so in the beginning of their 30s, quite unpleasant guys. And Lutz described the business model. I read the article, and it was perfectly written down, so from journalistic standards, right? They confronted also the real estate developers and asked them, okay, what is your point of view on your business model? And they integrated the quotes into the article. Everything was fine. Actually, it was a small article. It was a small article, and it was not an article that was shouting out, "Oh, look at these bastards!" Yeah, but it was, from my point of view, and I worked as a journalist for a long time, a perfectly written piece, right? Neutral, interesting, and it makes you aware of something that is going wrong. So that's actually what journalists should do. So a day before Christmas, Lutz was sued by the real estate developer, and of course that was on purpose, to do that a day before Christmas, and to say that the damage that was done by the article sums up to something like 25,000 euros. And now you can imagine what happened with these students and also with their families under the Christmas tree, right? I mean, everybody was now really shocked, and everybody was already thinking, okay, oh my God, how should I ever pay this back? And, Christmas was ruined, in other words, right? So, and the big fear started to make its round. Luckily, they had a good lawyer that worked pro bono, who saw the case and said, well, come on, let me just write a few letters and then we will see. So they had this lawyer, and the lawyer managed in the end, in the next year, then in the beginning of the next year, that they turned down the whole court case, because they couldn't win it, of course, but they turned down the whole court case. But there was a phase of, let's say, 3-4 weeks between Christmas and New Year's Eve, of course, that was really, really unpleasant for them. So that is what is happening even on this very small level, right? On this very low level. So with the students' newspaper. And now you can imagine how it feels if something like, let's say, a big company is turning against you, right? With a hell lot of money and talking about damage that sums up to millions. Okay, SLAPs. Framing journalists as enemies. Could you please give us the current example that you just told me when we were grabbing a coffee? That was really interesting.
Very well that our Prime Minister hates.
We can hardly understand, unfortunately. So maybe it's good to turn the laptop on.
Yeah, I turned the computer.
Is that better?
Yeah, I think
better
so.
now?
Yeah.
All right, so I was just saying that it's quite well known that our Prime Minister really hates media and journalism, and he was always like speaking badly against them. But about 2 days ago, there was a press conference where he, for one, came completely drunk, and well, like it's not a public knowledge, but you look at him and like you can see that he's drunk. And he's shouting at newspapers, at newspaper members and journalists there, like that they're lying and they're stupid and they should go screw themselves. Sorry for the expression. And he said, "You're lying. You're other words I'm not going to repeat." And it was a press conference of super short. He didn't take any questions, nothing. It was maybe like 5 to 10 minutes, and all he talked about was like speech about media and nothing else. And he was shouting. And it's actually quite interesting because so far, I mean, he always expressed his negative feelings towards media and its members. However, now it was really emotional. I mean, he was emotional also before, but it was purposefully emotional. Like it always seemed like he planned it certain way, that he wanted to show certain emotions to like sway the public's opinion. However, now it was like really an outburst, and it's a very new thing. I don't know whether that's what you meant that I should say, but
That's exactly what I meant. I noted down another example that was Miloš Zeman, the former president of the Czech Republic. He gave a press conference and he had a mock rifle with him, which looks like an AK-47. And on this mock rifle, you see an encryption, and the encryption says "for journalists." Yeah. So, and he turned the mock rifle, of course, towards the journalists, just telling them, okay, actually, what we should do with you is simply shoot you. Here are some examples. Yeah, Robert Fico, of course, top one. Yeah, that's a quote. Yeah, bloodthirsty bastards, says Robert Fico, Prime Minister of Slovakia, on journalists. But even more expressions that you don't want to tell us.
But he was like quite likely involved in the murder of the journalists
Yeah.
a few years back. Like 2018, that's why he was forced to give a demission and said he would never come back to politics. But here he is.
Yeah, we come to that also a bit later. Giorgia Meloni now in Italy, putting also pressure on the media system, also trying to establish her personnel at the public service media. She calls everything that is critical of her government fake news. We know this mechanism, of course, from the real Donald. Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš, who owns, as I already said, well, a lot of media outlets, he was running an advertisement when he was running for presidency that says, "Do you believe in media? Do you believe in media?" So what he wanted to say is, oh, you only get truthful information through me, but not through the media. Yeah? What he meant was, of course, legacy media. And legacy media back then was reporting about his misuse of EU subsidies. A national disgrace, former Slovenian Prime Minister Janez Janša on the National News Agency. And do we have another one? Yes, of course, Soros Mafia Network. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban on independent media. I mean, this is an often used label in the EU, that you are branded as somehow linked to Soros. So my NGO was also linked with Soros. We took some money from him, but unfortunately only a small amount. Yeah, so we got once, I don't know, something like 20,000 for a conference, and that's it. But only once. So he was not a constant donor, as I said, unfortunately, because OSF is a very attractive donor, the Open Society Foundation that was founded by George Soros. But even if you take a small amount, or even if you don't take any amount, well, it doesn't play a role. You are branded as a Soros organization, and that means you are belonging to this woke, liberal, human rights oriented community that is bothering guys like Viktor Orban, who think that they can define the world. Of course, if you have a political class that is talking about journalists like that, this also has an effect on the public, right? Or on the broader audience, on the society in total. That means it incites hate speech against journalists. And hate speech is the most common phenomena that journalists are confronted with, right? And we all think, okay, hate speech, well, yes, you can turn it on, you can turn your computer on, and you can turn your computer off. So hate speech is off when you turn your computer off, but it's not that simple, right? In a minute. My personal experience was that I saw really, really brave activists who were actually destroyed nearly by hate speech. Yeah, because if this goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and you have the feeling, okay, not only I am threatened, but also my family is threatened, right? And obviously, well, they get information from somewhere to also throw out information about my private or my personal life. Then you feel, okay, you are completely exposed, you are naked, you don't have any kind of protection. And of course, you are fearing that something might happen because someone might feel entitled to do harm. Please.
Yeah, so like obviously the effect on journalists and media is huge, but there is also effects on the public.
Can you turn the laptop again?
Yeah, sorry.
Effects on the public from the media, from the hate speech. For instance, it in Slovakia at least, it creates these echo chambers. Like we discussed it a little bit last week, where if Fico is saying, and not for weeks, but for years, for decades, saying negative things about media, then those people that vote for him, which is mainly the older generation, automatically don't believe media, and the more media speaks up against Fico, the more persuaded they are of their opinion, which is the opinion of Fico. So it creates this echo chambers that cannot be burst.
Yeah, undermines completely the credibility of journalists, of course. Okay, next point, that's 5 of 9. Disinformation and the anti-EU campaigns. As I said before, the autocracies often get in conflict then with the values and rights of the EU, and then something like an anti-EU sentiment is flourishing, and you could see that in Poland during the peace government. You can observe that today in Hungary, but you can also you could also see that in of course in the UK, right? And the combination of this sentiment against the EU plus disinformation led in the end to Brexit. And of course, the Brexit was a huge alarm symbol to the EU, because they thought, okay, And you remember that back then it was also discussed whether the Danes probably go out of the EU, and probably also other states in the Netherlands, and so on and so forth, right? So it was really a question whether the complete EU is collapsing because of these phenomena. Next point, the killing of investigative journalists. You were already mentioning one, that is Jan Kuciak. Jan Kuciak is here on the left. Jan Kuciak, investigative journalist, quite young, 27 years old, worked for Actuality.sk. Actuality.sk is an investigative, please correct me if I say something wrong, is investigative portal, is owned by German Axel Springer publishing house. And Jan Kuciak was investigating especially the ties between the mafia and the government, and he was reporting about organized crime. He went with his fiancée for the weekend into a house on the countryside, and there was actually really a kill team that came to the house, entered the house. He was shot in the head, and his fiancée was shot in the heart. So there were 2 people dead afterwards, and that was a clear message by the mafia, and probably also by the politicians involved. Get your hands off this kind of topic. Jan Kuciak. That was in 2018, but the beginning of everything was Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. Daphne was part of the Panama Paper investigation, and she revealed that the wife of the prime minister had a bank account that was affiliated with the Panama system, and that the wife was collecting black money on this bank account. Daphne Caruana Galizia one day went from her house to her car, drove a few hundred meters, and a car bomb then made her car explode. Her son, Matthew, she has 3 sons. I know Matthew quite well. Matthew, who's himself an investigative journalist, he heard the explosion. He went out of the house, but everything was already torn into pieces, the car and also his mother. That was also a huge, huge wake-up call for the EU, because before that they thought, okay, this kind of murder of journalists, right? This will happen in China, in Russia, in, I don't know, in Asia or somewhere else, but not in the EU. No way. But then with Daphne, it was quite clear, okay, this can also happen in the EU when you are an investigative journalist and you have a topic that is probably disturbing a lot of interests of powerful people. The next murdered journalists were Georgios Karaivas in Greece by a drive-by shooting. 2 people on a motorcycle shot him dead. Georgios Karaivas was also working on organized crime in Greece. And Peter de Vries in the Netherlands, a very prominent person, TV host, had his own show about criminal cases. And he was involved in a court case against the head of the drug mafia, against the head of the Mokro drug mafia. And he was the consultant to the Crown Witness. So he worked as the consultant to the Crown Witness. And he was shot in broad daylight, right? So on the street. He was offered protection beforehand by the state, but he refused the protection because he said, well, I want to live a free life, right? And I don't want to be intimidated by those guys. that also led probably to this successful assassination, unfortunately. Italy. So in Italy, well, everybody knows about really the dangers for investigative journalists. And about 20 journalists live under constant protection by the police, right? Italy has a very strong concept to protect these persons. I had the chance once on a conference in Rome to talk to one of these journalists who and still is under constant protection. Of course, this is a horrifying situation for your personal life, I must say, right? I mean, they have the feeling that they are in jail, right? I mean, you are constantly you have to obey the rules that other people are telling you. You cannot move around freely. You cannot probably go to public events and so on and so forth. Would you like to say a few words also about your knowledge about this situation in Italy?
I know for sure. Probably a journalist, but it's a writer who write and make like some investigation about mafia in Italy. You know Saviano. That's
Roberto Saviano.
Yeah. And I also heard about him talk about the situation and said it's very tough because you have also everything you cannot control, nothing. You have to do whatever the police have told you to do, and yeah, but especially in Italy with a strong presence of mafia. There is needed of the journalists have to be protected because they also had a few examples of not journalists but people in the law system that were shot and also bombed by the mafia. So when you have to deal with so delicate arguments, you have to be protected. But yeah, it's tough.
You want to add something? No. Yeah, thank you so much also for mentioning Roberto Saviano. He's probably the most prominent author and writer. Meloni already threatened to lift the protection of Roberto Saviano because Saviano is also in conflict with the new government. There is a hand up by Sophia. Sophia?
Yes, actually, as we were talking about that topic, I wanted to mention two Ukrainian journalists who were killed. One, I was already talking about him, like previous seminars, Georgi Gongadze in 2000, and another one, Pavlo Sharamet, who was killed in 2016. And his car was also exploded as the journalist that you talked about. So yeah, it's awful scenes.
Thank you, Sophia, for sharing this experience in Ukraine. I think the latest statistics for Ukraine say that 4 journalists were already killed during the year 2024 in Ukraine.
Yes, that's true.
There we have it. That's the statistic for 2024 provided by IFJ, which is the International Federation of Journalists. And there you can see these 4 killed journalists in Europe. These are journalists from Ukraine. Of course, the situation is also devastating, as you all know, in Mexico and in Middle America. Then you see a lot of journalists being killed in the Middle East and the Arab world, of course, also in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. Okay. One thing is murder. The other thing is physical attacks on journalists. Here you see the situation in Germany. And there you see, okay, that was my former NGO, the ECPMF. So we started investigating the cases from 2015 on, when the right-wing populist movement Pegida started to demonstrate and started to march through Dresden. And then all of a sudden there was a rise of physical attacks against journalists, and the concept of the lying press, the Lügenpresse, was made popular, right? So there was a relatively high number in 2015. So it sank then in 2016, 2017. We all thought, okay, obviously it's stabilizing on a quite low level. And then the pandemic came. And so since the year 2020, so the number of physical attacks even exceed the times of Pegida. So it's getting worse. And why is it getting worse? Because this concept of a lying press is now believed not only by people belonging to right-wing populist movements, but to all kinds of groups who think or who have certain belief systems and who feel that these belief systems are not reflected in the media, right? And these belief systems can be conspiracy theories, can be religious beliefs, can be strong political beliefs, and so on and so forth, right? So what they all have in common is this concept of an enemy called the journalist. What is interesting is we also try to identify the political spectrum of the perpetrators. And what you see is that the left is in the minority. Of course, there are also left-wing attacks on journalists. You have a lot of right-wing attacks. This is in gray. You cannot see the number now because of the screen. But the majority cannot be fixed as belonging to one or the other political spectrum. That is new, right? So obviously the attacks on journalists come from private persons, and you cannot say this is a left-wing person or a right-wing person. Yeah, you can only say, okay, this is a person taking part in the demonstration and all of a sudden attacking a journalist. Yeah? That makes it also difficult, very difficult for journalists to protect themselves against them, because anyone could literally attack you. Statistic summary, main types of attacks in EU member states. Here you see the physical attacks. Of course, the highest number is verbal attacks. Property means that property is stolen, like cameras, or destroyed. Legal includes slaps, and censorship is, for example, if a country refuses to hand in, for instance, files when you ask as a journalist, right? And tries to hinder your investigation. Economic weakness and ownership. So one form of a distorted market is the media capture. The other one is that oligarchs are buying media outlets. And this is happening also in Western Germany, Western Europe a lot. For instance, in France, you have a lot of entrepreneurs who own really huge companies and who then buy media outlets. They are not necessarily buying media outlets to sell journalism, but they are buying media outlets to gain influence, to gain political influence. Often these owners are affiliated also with the government because they take over commissions from the government. They produce partly for the government, for example, military goods and so on and so forth. So the risk that they influence the content is very high. And that's an unfortunate and sad development in Western Europe, which takes more and more room. Last point, economic weakness and news deserts. Local journalism is, of course, extremely affected by the economic weakness of the sector. Here you see the map of the US. There you see already a lot of communities and districts who have no newspaper at all, or only one newspaper. Yeah? If you don't have any newspaper at all, the situation gets critical, and I will tell you in a second why. That's the German map. So you see that Germany is still completely covered with newspapers and media outlets. So the situation is still fairly okay. But if you compare this to the situation 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it's completely different already. And there is, so to say, an outlook delivered by the BDZV. The BDZV is the German organization of the publishers. And they say the delivery of newspapers will not be profitable for 40% of all German municipalities in 2025. So that means in the next year, you will see a lot of dying newspapers in Germany, and it's not clear if they are substituted by anything. So usually you would say, okay, the newspaper is away, but if the journalism stays, fair enough. So also people can get informed online. But that's often not the case because online is not getting as much revenue as the old newspaper model. So what happens if you don't have any kind of journalistic coverage in local communities? And these are the results of studies. The first thing that happens is an increase of corruption on all levels. You have a decrease in the voter participation. You have a declining identification with the place of residence. You have, of course, a higher receptivity for disinformation and conspiracy theories. And you have a dependency on publications provided by local elites. Could also be parties, right? So the AfD, the German right-wing populists, they start to hand in papers for free that give you sort of local information, some advertisements, but of course then also articles that favor their politics, right? So there's a vacuum, and this vacuum is then used by people who have a certain interest to inform you in a certain way. So on the ground, my assumption, so the regulatory framework, so that sums up a bit my experience, alone is not a guarantee for media freedom. Media freedom depends also, of course, on the political will. And the common respect for journalism as a pillar of democracy, and also on the economic dynamic of the business, which is an important part. Okay, thank you for now. I will stop here.
Okay, so we start with a recommendation on the safety of journalists. So I explained to you before there are these three different categories of legislative initiatives, and one is a recommendation, which is the weakest in the sense of it's a, as the word says, is a recommendation to the member states. It's like highlighting an issue and inviting them to act on it. And so the question is, what problem does this recommendation try to solve? So we heard a lot about this from Lutz before, the increasing threats to journalists. So it addresses the rise in threats and the attacks against journalists in the EU, including harassment, intimidation, and violence. Also, there is a problem that it tries to address, which is the gender-specific risks. It recognizes that female journalists face specific threats such as gender-based violence and online harassment, which is unfortunately the case. It also addresses digital safety concerns, so tackles challenges related to online threats and the digital security of journalists. And it is also providing some ideas around impunity of crime. So it aims to reduce the impunity by promoting robust investigations and prosecution of criminal acts against media professionals. So this is really the problem that it wants to tackle. It has been adopted in September 2021, which is like 3 years ago. And the content is, if you look at the content side of the legislation, it introduces some protective measures for journalists. So it encourages member states to implement effective measures to ensure the safety of journalists, both online and offline. It focuses on female journalists. It gives a kind of digital empowerment. So it promotes digital literacy and security trainings for media professionals to counter online threats, so they know how to deal with it. It also suggests a legal framework. It recommends the establishment of independent national support services, including helplines and legal advice for journalists facing threats. And it also suggests monitoring and reporting approaches. So there should be national mechanisms in place that monitor and report attacks against journalists. Again, just a recommendation. But it is part of the EU broader effort to strengthen media freedom and pluralism across member states. And that was one of the first initiatives that we have seen in the recent past. All right, so the recommendation on the safety of journalists. The next one I'd like to briefly introduce is the Digital Services Act. So the Digital Services Act tries to address the problem of harmful online content. So the spread of illegal and harmful content, including hate speech, disinformation, counterfeit products on social media platforms. It also addressed the problem of lack of transparency in the sense of what are the algorithms about, what is the platform's decision-making process for certain content to show, to be on the platform and others not. It addresses also accountability gaps. So it imposes clear responsibilities on digital platforms for content moderation. It addresses the problem of user rights. So what can you as a user do to be ensured that there's fair treatment and recourse mechanisms for content removal? Because that's also happening very often, that you are presented in a context that is just created, made up, and not very positive for you. So you want to do something against it. And then it also addresses the problem of fragmented rules. So it's about the harmonization of digital service regulations across the EU. And I mean, the nature of the platforms is obviously cross-border. So that is another attempt here. So the legislation went into force in November 2022. It was one of the bigger legislative initiatives at European level. And I think it's only since early this year, 2024, that it is really fully applicable across all the entities. What you can see here on the slide is also this graph, which is a pyramid and indicating like the different categories of platforms. I think the special thing about the Digital Services Act is that it has the different rules for the different size of the platforms and let's say their power they have on the market at the end of the day. So you have these very large online platforms and they are defined, that reaching more than 10% of 450 million consumers in Europe. And then you have normal online platforms, hosting service, intermediary service, so all these different categories, they enjoy different level of regulation. The key provisions of this regulation is that the platforms must remove illegal content quickly and transparently. There are stricter obligations for larger platforms in place now, including risk assessments, algorithm transparency, and independent audits. So also bringing more transparency into this whole field. It bans targeting minors and sensitive data in ads. That's also for protection of minors regulation. There's also another legislative piece around this, but this is kind of linked up here. And it ensures users can appeal content moderation decisions. So making sure that you have a go-to point where you can say, okay, this content is about me. It's not just, and I want to remove it. So then there are ways of doing this. So this is the Digital Services Act that is looking into these points. Another one, which is very similar in the name, is the Digital Markets Act, and but it refers more to the economic aspects of platforms. And the problem it tries to address is the unfair practices of gatekeepers. So anti-competitive practices by large online platforms. So they're called gatekeepers because they are the ones that you need to go to in order to either disseminate your information or to monetize your content as a media company. And the practices that they put in place, of course, make you very dependent on how you can, in the end, monetize your content, how you can access your audience, and so on and so forth. So then it addresses the problem of the lack of fair competition, because sometimes smaller media businesses have, let's say, more challenging or more difficult access to these platforms than bigger companies. Then also it addresses the problem of consumer choice and innovation. So it prevents gatekeepers from shifting innovation and restricting consumer choice. And it also addresses the problem of cross-border market barriers. So making sure, again, that the digital market rules really apply and are harmonized across the EU to avoid fragmented regulation, which makes it otherwise so difficult if we talk here about a single market. In terms of timeline, it's a regulation that has been adopted in October 2022, and it fully went into force only earlier this year in March. So again, you can see the time gaps, and at the same time, technology is evolving and developing so quickly. It's a challenge for the regulator to keep up with the speed of innovation. I can tell you a bit about what is the content of the regulation. It is about allowing interoperability with third-party services. It is prohibiting self-preference. So, for example, Google has a service called Google News, and they are collecting content from different news sources. But Google News goes always first in the search. So you are always directed to Google News. At least that was before this Digital Market Act came into place. And you are not directed to other platforms that are doing a similar kind of thing of generating content from different news services. So there was a competitive disadvantages for those who were not part of the Google family. And this is something that this regulation is addressing here. It restricts bundling of services to lock-in users. So that's another thing where you have, I don't know, I mean, we feel it, I think, with Microsoft. So we are using Microsoft Office as a tool. And you do this in the working environment, in your team. So it's really hard to change the system if you're locked in one system. And that's the same for platforms if they offer like a bundle of services where you find it hard to get out and you're really losing something there. And then, of course, to ensure also data portability and access for business users. So in the media context, that means if you have any understanding of who are the people actually clicking on the link on the article in the search engine or in your Google News service, that this data, this information needs to be made available also to the publisher, for example, so he understands better who is actually accessing the content. Yeah, so you see on this little image here the different gatekeepers. So just to illustrate a little bit who they are. Okay, then let's move to the anti-SLAPP directive. It's a completely different field. So that is not so much about platforms. That is what Lutz explained already before. So these are the rules to protect against strategic lawsuits. And strategic lawsuits are aimed to literally silence journalists. And it's a real problem, because if you are a journalist in a media company, then usually you have like the infrastructure around yourself with the legal team of the media company and financial support to counter these lawsuits. But if you are an independent freelance journalist, completely independent, then these lawsuits, they just kill you in the sense of financial means that you need to have at hand to respond to this, the lawyers that you need to hire, and so on. With the very sad consequence of self-censorship, so that these kind of journalists who are attacked or part of these lawsuits, they just go silent, and that's exactly what they want to achieve. The SLAPP directive is addressing this problem. Well, with the one caveat, this is really just for cross-border lawsuits. If you are within a country and you counter these lawsuits, the SLAPP directive doesn't apply. So that's just one element that needs to be said here as well, and that would require national legislation. Yeah. Okay, maybe I can just maybe quote the Vice President for Values and Transparency, Vera Jourova, who is was a Czech Vice President until 2 weeks ago, responsible for media freedom also within the European Commission. And she kind of highlighted in this context that the right to freedom of expression information, including the respect for the freedom and pluralism of the media, are fundamental rights and core values of the European Union. And I think statements like this create the kind of trust that citizens have in the EU to handle these kind of issues from a regulatory perspective better than some national governments would do, because they don't express really this level of commitment. Okay, I will not go too much into the technical details of this one, but happy to share more if you are interested in. Then let's have a look into the AI Act. The AI Act is relatively new from this summer regulation that has come out. It is addressing the problem of the lack of harmonized AI regulations. AI, artificial intelligence, is of course something that everyone now is talking about, and we are all not so sure what exactly to expect, and the media field in particular. Because there are some aspects which are really positive in terms of making processes within the editorial rooms more efficient, for example. But then, of course, there's also a potential risk that AI can take over certain things, and then also, the kind of content that is available out there. If you don't really know, with deep fakes, if it's AI created or not. So there's a risk of this mingling in the perception, at least, between reality and artificially created content. And we discussed this in one of our sessions with Charlie Beckett in particular. And the IRECT is responding to this challenge also. So it is about addressing the mitigation of AI-related risks, so making sure that there are measures in place that prevent potential harms from AI systems, so that they are safe, transparent, and respect fundamental rights. And they are also addressing the problem of market fragmentation. As I said, this has been proposed by the Commission in 2021, so that's where you see very nicely the timeline, actually. And it really came into force only on the 1st of August 2024. So it took 3 years to build it. And again, in the meantime, we had generative AI coming on the market, which then has been reflected also in this regulation. But when they started discussing it, nobody knew about generative AI. So what is it? What is in there? So there's one element which is about risk-based classification. So it categorizes AI systems into 4 risk levels, and you see them here in this pyramid on the slide. So high, unacceptable risk, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk. So for unacceptable risk, for example, it bans AI systems that pose unacceptable risks, such as social scoring by governments. So that's what you experience in China, for example. Yeah, so that every citizen has, I think, 5 points, and you collect points through your behavior. And the AI system is helping to collect this data and to putting you into the different categories. And according to the category you are in, you can access certain schools or you can buy certain products. And so it literally has a tremendous impact on your everyday life. So this is unacceptable from the European perspective. Then high-risk AI systems, so subjects AI systems used in critical areas. So for example, in healthcare or law enforcement, to strict requirements. So that's really introducing the rules how to deal with it there. That's also referring to data governance, for example, human oversight, cybersecurity measures, and so on. And then you have the 2 other categories where it's more about transparency obligations, so that you literally inform the audience that this content or this image, this movie or this film has been produced with the help of AI, so that you are aware as a user, a consumer, what it is about. Yeah, then this is also about governance and enforcement. So that means there need to be bodies in place, authorities in place that that can keep control about AI and how it is applied at national level. So like an European Artificial Intelligence Board, but also something similar at national level, so national supervisory authorities. And then, of course, it rules out a system of penalties for non-compliance, so how to deal with that. So this is a bit like a tricky approach to balance between innovation that you don't really want to stop, but at the same time protecting the fundamental rights of citizens in Europe. And the wider feedback of the field is that this is a very, let's say, positive regulation and coming at the right time. But of course, it depends on how the whole AI technology is now developing, if it will be really strong enough to deal with that in the future. Good. Now, last one I have for you is the European Media Freedom Act. And before going there, I would like to introduce to you very briefly a short role play that I want to suggest to you. Because the European Media Freedom Act has been one of these legislative files that has created a lot of noise across Europe in many different stakeholder groups. And I just want us to get a bit of a feel what these different positions or perspectives could be. And that's why I would like to suggest, when I have introduced the European Media Freedom Act to you in a moment, in a condensed way, obviously, that we go into small groups again. And I have 4 groups here, and each group is representing one perspective or stakeholder group. So one group is the European Commission representative. Another group is the national government official. The third group is a media organization executive. So for example, a publishing house or a TV station. And the 4th group is a journalist. Yeah. And I just want you to think through, put yourself in the shoes of these people and think through, okay, what is it what I want to get through for the European Media Freedom Act? The European Media Freedom Act has been adopted this year in May. So really one of the last acts also of the European Parliament before the European elections in June this year. But the new rules will only apply as from August next year. So there's still an implementation phase. And you heard maybe also that Prime Minister Orban in Hungary kind of launched a court case against the European Media Freedom Act at the European Court because he felt this is not appropriate and not acceptable from his perspective. So maybe if we just follow the same kind of split up as we just had a moment ago, and if I can just impose on group 1 being the European Commission representative, group 2 being the national government official, group 3 the media organization, so publishing house or so, and group 4, which is here the online group, taking the journalist perspective. Yeah, and then have a discussion in a moment. But I will explain to you briefly what the European Media Freedom Act is about. So, first of all, maybe to start with, it's very unusual that the European Commission is taking the lead on a media regulation, because normally regulating media is something that is left to the member state level, and in Germany even to the federal level, so to the Bundesländer level. So that is, there was a bit of a question of, okay, who is really in charge here? And the European Commission managed to get there because they put it not under the headline of media, but under the headline of single market. And single market is clearly something that the European Commission is responsible for. So you have to think through about this regulation from that perspective to understand why the EU and also what the EU is trying to regulate here. So the problems that they wanted to address with this regulation is, or that they are addressing, is political interference with media. Yeah, so this undue political influence in editorial decisions. Secondly, it's surveillance concerns. So to protect journalists from surveillance practices, including the misuse of spyware. Yeah, that was a big case also, well, in Greece and different countries actually. Then we have the third point is about transparency deficits. So there was not really a source where you could find who is the media owner of a certain company, where is state advertising going. So this whole area was very intransparent and therefore not really helpful for media independence. And the fourth point is about market fragmentation. So establishing a unified framework for media services across the EU internal market. So we talked already about the timeline. So what's in there? There are a lot of points here, and maybe I just pick 3 or 4 to not kind of overwhelm you with content, but it would be good to keep that in mind also for your discussions in a moment. So let me see. I think the one point that is really important is about the editorial independence. Yeah, so to safeguard, introducing a safeguard against political interference in media operations. So it is about making sure that there is not one single person or one single interest that can literally influence the editorial room. This relates to the topic of media capture, but that also relates to a topic of a publisher, referring now to German Mittelstand, so the medium-sized publishing houses, where it's very normal that the publisher walks into the newsroom and just tells them what he thinks about the world, and that his newspaper or her newspaper should take a certain direction. So that is something that's also very contested at German level. Let me see what second point, ownership transparency. Yeah, so to really understand who is the owner and who potentially interferes with the positioning of a media is another important point that's covered here. State advertising transparency is another one. So as you know, in some countries, state advertising is a very important source of revenue for legacy media. So newspapers, but also TV. And of course that, and as we discussed before, that is a source of dependence. If you don't write or broadcast in a certain direction content-wise, then the government might just say, we cut the state advertising, and then you see where you get to. Happened to one of the companies that I'm working with in Poland. The moment my media fund kind of got into this company, the next day, state advertising was cut. That was a drop of 25% of the revenues overnight. And that is, of course, in the media sector, it's quite a lot. So just to mention that. Then we also have audience measurement transparency. So audience measurement is very important if you want to sell advertising, for example. Yeah. So you tell the advertiser, actually, we have, I don't know, 1 million readers per week of our top 5 articles. But to make sure that we are all measuring according to the same kind of criteria, this is now introduced by the EMFA. And then let me see if there's another one. Yeah, maybe also this market concentration assessment is also an important one, which obliges member states to evaluate the impact of media market concentration on pluralism and editorial independence. Since we were talking about the European Commission, the people who are now in the new European Commission responsible for these regulations and future regulations in the field. So the most important person is Henna Virkkunen from Finland. So she is Executive Vice President for tech sovereignty, security, and democracy. And everything that has to do with media will land on her table or will be somehow, needs her involvement and ideally as an initiator. So Henna Virkkunen used to be an MEP, member of the European Parliament before, from the EPP group, so the Conservatives. And voila, so she is the person to go to. Then she has a side, she has 2 other commissioners who could have a say. So one is Michael McGrath from Ireland, also responsible as a commissioner now, so one level further down, for democracy, justice, and rule of law. So you can see immediately they interlinked, these themes. And then the other one is Glenn McCullough from Malta, who is the Commissioner for Intergenerational Fairness, Youth, Culture, and Sport. And in the field of culture, you have also an element of media, and that is covered by him. And then for some things, in particular on the platform side, which we have seen is really important, we have Teresa Ribera Rodriguez. She is the Executive Vice President of the European Commission from Spain, and she has been in the media all over before the new commission came in place. So maybe you have followed that a little bit. And she is responsible for clean, just, and competitive transition. So this competition aspect is really the one that is important here for us.